So now we're going to talk about building our first NodeJS application that uses MongoDB and the MongoDB NodeJS driver. What is the NodeJS driver? What does it mean to be a driver for MongoDB? This is a little bit of our overall architecture. We have our MongoDB server listening here for incoming connections. The server expects to communicate using MongoDB's wire protocol, represented by this line here, and exchange data in BSON. Now, a driver is actually a library in a specific language, in this case, JavaScript. The driver communicates with the MongoDB server using the wire protocol. It handles things like opening sockets, detecting errors, and managing connections to replica sets. In general, a driver handles a lot of things behind the scenes that you don't want to have to deal with in your application code. The idea is just that you include the driver for MongoDB, the Node.js driver in this case, and use it in your application just like you would any other library. So let's take our first look at the Node.js driver. Here we have our app.js file. We'll work through this example application as we learn to use the Node.js driver. Before we get started, let's actually try to run this app. So I type node app.js. When we try to run it, we can see that there is a missing dependency. In particular, Node cannot find the MongoDB module. So I did this to illustrate that the MongoDB driver for Node.js is actually a module. All Node.js MongoDB applications have this module as a dependency. At the moment, we don't have the MongoDB Node.js driver installed for our application. So in order to run this app, we need to use npm to install the driver. When you do this, you'll get this warning. This warning is okay to ignore. If you'd like to read more about what the cause of this is, you can visit the Node.js driver documentation. In short, this is something we only need to deal with if we actually need to use Kerberos authentication, and we're definitely not doing that in this class. All right, so now we have our MongoDB driver installed. If we look in the application directory, we can see that we have a node_modules subdirectory, and we can see that within that directory is in fact our MongoDB module. Now let's run this app. Okay, and this application did what was expected, which is to print out the titles of each of the movies found in our video.movies collection. Now let's take a look at the code for this application. So let's start with the require statements. You can see here the dependency on the MongoDB driver specified in this require statement. This module exposes the Mongo client object, and we use this object then to connect to our MongoDB server. Now it's common to also use the assert module distributed with Node.js, and we're using it here just to do a little bit of error checking. Okay, let's get to the meat of this then. In order to use the MongoDB Node.js driver, it's important to have a solid understanding of the asynchronous nature of I/O in JavaScript, including database requests. Now, the Mongo shell is synchronous, meaning that when you issue a find command, it blocks, waiting for the command to return before continuing. This is not the case with the Node.js driver. Whether you're doing a query, as we are here in the call to find, or just setting up a connection to the database. As is common in JavaScript applications, the Node.js driver we're going to use is designed so that its methods function asynchronously. What this means is that instead of waiting on a return value from any methods we call, we instead pass in a callback function. Now, I'll try to unpack this idea of callbacks in this lesson, but if this is the first time you're seeing callback functions, I strongly recommend that you dive into a JavaScript resource outside this class or another resource to learn the ins and outs of callbacks. So the way the connect method works is we pass as its first parameter a connection string. Essentially, this says we're going to connect to MongoDB on localhost at port 27017. 27017 is the default MongoDB port. And we want to connect to the video database. The callback function that we pass as the second parameter is going to handle the result of this connection operation. So when the operation completes, whether it was an error or a successful connection, this function will be called. In the case of an error, this assertion will fail, and execution of this particular script will terminate with an appropriate assertion failure message. If it succeeds, and that's what we would expect here, if we've got a MongoDB server running on localhost at 27017, then the connection handle will be passed as the value for the DB parameter. Now, throughout the rest of this callback, we can use this DB handle to interact with the database. Okay, so in the case where we successfully connect to the database, we're going to print out this log message and then immediately do a find. Now, there's a whole bunch of things we need to talk about with regard to this find call here. Let me start first by saying that, again, we're going to be passing a callback function. Okay, and the thing to keep in mind here is that within this function, when we do this call to find, because this happens asynchronously, again, we're not waiting on a return value for the call to find. Instead, we fire off a thread that will handle this request and pick up execution in this callback once the request finishes. But that thread is blocked until the find command returns. The main thread of execution, or I should say, the thread of execution for this particular callback, the one we begin here, will continue in parallel. So what will happen is we'll actually end up printing out this log message before anything inside this function happens. Okay, so let's talk about find here a little bit. Now, this syntax should be familiar to you. Here we're simply using the DB handle, specifying, using the collection method here, specifying that we want to issue a query to the movies collection. And we're going to use the find command. Now, note here that we're passing an empty document, meaning that we're not applying any constraints on documents that are matched. And as we know, the effect of that will be that we will get all of the documents in this collection in our result set. Now, remember that find returns a cursor. So I don't actually want to interact with the cursor here. Instead, I'd prefer to just use the native JavaScript for each function, which works with arrays. So what I'm going to do is, on the cursor that's returned from find, I'm going to call the toArray method. All right, what's going to happen there is that this method will consume the entire result set and produce an array that then gets passed to this callback. Now again, if there was an error in this call, then the error object would be passed to this parameter. In the case of success, the result of calling toArray is going to be passed to the second parameter. Now, this is a common idiom in JavaScript that for callbacks, the first parameter is where error objects will be passed, and the second parameter is where the result of whatever operation we're waiting on will be passed. In this case, toArray produces an array, so it is that array with our entire result set in it that'll be passed to the docs parameter. Then what we're going to do here is, using the forEach method for arrays, loop through the docs and one at a time print out the title for each document in our result set. Again, here we're using a callback to do this. The last thing I want to call out here with regard to the execution of this function is that doc is just going to be a JSON object here because we're working in the JavaScript language, and the NodeJS driver is going to take the BSON data that it gets back from MongoDB and map it to native JavaScript data types. So what's going to happen here is that we can use the standard JavaScript notation for accessing properties of objects to get a hold of the title for the document each time through this loop. Finally here, we're going to use this DB handle and we're going to close the connection that was passed in here. This will terminate this callback. And what's interesting here is that the thread of execution for this callback will already have terminated, executing all of the statements it was designed to run. Okay, so that should give you a pretty good idea of how to get started using the Node.js driver for MongoDB. We talked a little bit about the fundamentals, establishing a connection and issuing a command. We also talked about how we stipulate what database we want to talk to and the syntax for accessing a particular collection. Finally, we spent a fair amount of time talking about callbacks and multiple threads of execution that are going to be fired off as this application runs. So now, let's run this app again. And with what we now know about how it works, we'll have a good idea for how the results are produced. Last thing I want to point out here is that, as promised, this log message, which we find here, prints out before any of the titles for the 3 documents in the movies collection. Again, because when this command is issued, this thread of execution fires it off and moves on executing the next statement.